Trade supply in this nationwide contest. That's bank to 200-200. This is the Ross Kaminsky Show. Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am for this conversation. My very special guest, the first time on the Ross Kaminsky Show, Mike Sulick, retired from the CIA back in 2010 as the director of the National Clandestine Service after a nearly 3-decade career in intelligence. Mike, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. Before we jump into the news of the day kind of stuff, can you just tell folks what NCS is and does within CIA?
It was the National Clandestine Service, basically responsible for coordinating what's called the human intelligence activities, which of the intelligence community, which is basically gathering secrets from spies around the world. It's since been renamed as the Directorate of Operations, which was its old name years ago.
Now, and if you can answer this without having to kill all of us afterwards, were you in operations? Were you a spy yourself at some point in your career?
I was an intelligence officer. In other words, I recruited and met with spies to debrief them to get intelligence information.
Interesting. And I note that you speak Russian and Polish and Spanish.
Correct.
And I'm curious, last thing on your background, did you learn those languages, especially the Russian and Polish, because it was a professional requirement after going into intelligence, or did you learn them before and maybe that became a factor in why you went into intelligence?
Yeah, I studied Russian in high school and in college and in graduate school, and I'm pretty sure that's why I was hired. I learned Polish and Spanish after I got in prior to my assignments to those countries.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so many of us have seen the story in the news of this guy named Paul Whelan, who Russia has arrested and accused of being a spy. And I've got a couple things that really jump out at me about it. Number one, it actually hasn't gotten as much attention as I might have thought for a story that I think is kind of a big story. And number two, I haven't heard President Trump say a thing about it, which seems a little odd for him. But so what was your first reaction when you heard the story?
Well, it didn't surprise me at all after the arrest of Ms. Butina. I wasn't surprised that the Russians would probably seek a bargaining chip. This is a well-known ploy that they've used dating back to the earliest days of the Cold War. So I thought this was inevitable.
Wow. Okay, so clearly this is a game that's played a lot. And for those of you who hadn't followed the news before, Maria Butina was would you call her a spy?
I would say, I don't know all the facts about the case, but yeah. I would look at her as kind of a low-level operative, what we would an access agent. This is hardly the James Bond of Russian intelligence.
Right. So she came to the United States and tried to make nice with apparently people on the political right and the NRA, and got in some situation where she was actually able to ask Donald Trump a question at some point. But like you said, hardly the James Bond. But in any case, now we've got her, and I guess the Russians want her back. The fact that the Russians want her back, does that change how you think about her, or would they want pretty much anyone back who was in that kind of situation, even if they weren't James Bond?
Well, it could be both. I mean, clearly, the Russians publicly through the foreign ministry and Putin himself have protested this arrest. So, in a sense, this is a way to convey to their populace that, see, if somebody gets arrested like that, we will stand by our citizens. Beyond that, I mean, she may have more access to information that we are unaware of.
How do you think, then, to the extent this is part of a game where, we want someone to trade for the person you have, how do you think the Russians picked this guy, Whelan?
Well, in past cases, years ago, dating back half a century ago, they arrested an American professor on a kind of a similar cases. Whelan's, he was a researcher, Yale professor on Russian studies, frequently traveled there. Later on, 1986, they arrested a journalist from the U.S. News and World Report, Nicholas Donilov. Somebody who get well versed in Russia, as his name suggests. He of Russian background, spoke the language. So I think this is, there's a pattern here. Mr. Whalen clearly has had some interest in Russia, traveled there, was on Russian social media platform and the like.
So they pick these people because they can make a at least slightly credible argument, like here's some interest, some unusual interest in or knowledge about Russia that makes them more likely to be a spy, just
exactly
for propaganda
right.
purposes.
Yeah, exactly right. It fits the pattern. It's easier to frame them, basically.
Now, do you have any reason to believe that this guy actually is an agent to the U.S. government in any way?
No, I mean, certainly the CIA would never use an American without diplomatic immunity in some spy operation like this. It just doesn't make sense.
Right, okay, so can you explain that a little bit? Right, we often hear about, the consular, the science attaché. Can you talk about how this works a little bit?
Well, on both sides, they use officers who work under cover and are overseas with diplomatic immunity. So if they're, let's say, a American CIA officer is arrested, he enjoys diplomatic immunity. He'll be locked up for an hour or two and then basically freed. And the same thing works on the other side. It's just the essence of diplomatic immunity, but it does provide some protection for the officers on both sides. People without diplomatic immunity is a different story. They've had many cases in the past where retaliation or was done where somebody is a spy on one side is arrested, spy on the other side then is arrested, and eventually a swap is arranged. Probably one of the most well-known incidents of that is coming from that movie a few years ago, The Bridge of Spies, in which France's Gary Powers flew a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over the Soviet Union, was shot down, obviously involved in a spying mission. Had no diplomatic immunity. He was tried and convicted, but eventually he's traded for a Russian spy, what we call an illegal, Rudolph Abel, who was working in the United States, with no contact with the government at all, and he's arrested. The two of them are traded. In other situations where Russians have been, intelligence officers have been arrested who don't have diplomatic immunity, the Russians have said, well, we need a bargaining chip. We need an equivalent. So they drum up a case of somebody, and then usually they're pretty ham-handed at counters. In this case, I mentioned the Barkhorn, the professor, and Donilov, the journalist. Literally, somebody walked up to them and handed them a wad of papers, and immediately the Russian intelligence jumped in to arrest them. Whalen's arrest sounds almost like the same thing from what I've seen in media reports. The only updated version is they shoved a flash drive into his hands rather than pieces of paper.
Right. That's exactly. So it seems that. So do you think they would have picked a guy like Whalen who did not have any kind of official cover because that's an analog to Butina, who was in the United States without any official cover?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and have you ever yourself, and there won't be a follow-up question, I won't ask you for any details because I know you wouldn't answer the question anyway, but have you ever had to organize one of these trades yourself?
I was a little bit involved when the 10 illegals got arrested, if you recall that.
Yeah.
10 Russian illegals arrested in 2010.
What would be your best guess as to how this thing with Whalen is going to play out and over what time frame?
I'm surprised that more details haven't come out about what he actually did. There's been some glimmers about, he was handed this flash drive and so on. So I think, the Russians are probably trying to make a good case for this. They've initially said, we're not interested in any trade, but I think they're sitting there waiting until, the Americans want their man back, so maybe they'll come to us, and of course that gives them the upper hand. All the Americans approached us for a trade. But, hopefully behind the scenes, some negotiations or something are taking place.
Our very special guest, Mike Sulick, is the former director of CIA's National Clandestine Service. Mike, does it mean anything to you that the administration, as far as I can tell, hasn't said a word about this situation? The president surely hasn't.
Yeah, well, the Secretary of State, immediately afterwards, made kind of a strong statement about that. I think the fact that the Ambassador Huntsman, actually went, usually these cases when Americans arrested for anything, the consular officer from the embassy or from a consulate has the right to visit that person in prison. Mm-hmm. Well, in this case, the ambassador himself went, which I think gave it some more high-level attention as a result of that.
Okay, that makes sense. I've also noticed, or have noticed, like when you notice silence, you notice something that isn't there. The CIA has been substantially out of the news lately, which I imagine would make you and our mutual friend Mike Morrell and other intelligence professionals pretty happy. How do you feel about the fact that the CIA, which was in the news so much, let's say 2 years ago, is barely mentioned at all in the news these days?
Yes, I feel great about it. We never want to be in the news. Usually
right.
What it is, it's not for anything positive, because anything positive we do has to stay secret.
Mm-hmm. One of the few news stories I saw lately, and this is, I think, something that fits really well into your professional background. I'll give you the headline from NPR. CIA chief, talking about Gina Haspel, CIA chief pushes for more spies abroad. And then the second thing they say is surveillance makes that harder. Do you agree with the concept that we need more humans? And there was a lot of talk during the Clinton years that part of our intelligence services really suffered.
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely feel you get more human intelligence abroad. I mean, although there is so much available in open source materials in the media, social media platforms, and so on, there is still that small percentage of secrets that are very hard to get, but are essential for our government to know, that we have to get. And usually the ones we're most interested in are the places that are hardest to penetrate. Mm-hmm. North Korea certainly being at the top of that list, Iran and China as well, because of the surveillance network in their own countries.
So, yeah, fascinating. So typically, and I'm just going to drift off into the way it all works right now. If you were to, still be doing what you were doing before and attempting to get an asset in any one of those countries, usually, in the rare occasion that you're able to, is the motivation of that agent wanting something better for their own country, or are they just like mercenaries? They just want the money, or maybe there isn't a generic answer. But what are the usual motivations of people who are willing to take the kind of risk of spying against Iran while living in Iran, for example?
Well, they're all the motivations you just mentioned. I mean, it could be ideological. It's often resentment, not only against their government, but against a superior. They were passed over for a promotion. Obviously, a lot of times money is. So some people, it's the thrill of it. They're suddenly very, important. They're a James Bond figure and so on. Mm-hmm. In most of the really good cases, it's usually a combination of motives. People are disgruntled with their government, but they also want money at the same time, either for medical treatment or children's education, or sometimes just out of pure greed.
How active do you think, especially the Iranians and the Chinese, I would think more than North Korea, are in trying to send you a double agent and trying to get you to recruit someone who's really working for them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Iranians have certainly become much more conscious, even in their own country, about foreign spying, particularly American spying, and they all of these services I think have learned well. The example of the Russians, the East Germans, and the Cubans all ran these extensive double agent programs during the Cold War to feed false information. So I think they're all getting much more sophisticated at doing, or have become more sophisticated at doing that.
Very interesting. All right, Mike, I'm gonna let you go. I really appreciate your time. Mike Sulick is the former director of the CIA's National Clandestine Service. It's great to have you on the show, and thank you for nearly 30 years serving our country in the intelligence services. I'm very grateful.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, likewise. Wow. All right, there's a guy you don't get on the air too often. By the way, the reason, just so you know, the way I heard about him even, I probably should have heard about him before, but he wrote an interesting piece at a website called The Cipher Brief, and then Cipher, CIPHER, brief.com. And it's a subscription website, and I don't have a subscription right now. But there's a lot of fantastic stuff in there that really relates to it's really an intelligence website, and a bunch of people writing for it who are or were involved with CIA. Michael Morell is involved with this project too. So if you're interested in a website that is really about intel and foreign policy, I would encourage you to check out thecipherbrief.com. If you don't remember the name, just email me and I'll tell you. I'll tell you what. I just